Hey everyone, I am Annika and welcome to my channel where I share lots of fun woodworking and DIY projects and I break them down so you can make them too. Now lately I have made a bunch of plywood projects like my kitchen floating shelves, a record player cabinet, a dresser, and what that means is that my plywood scrap pile has grown exponentially. So when my friend Lindy from Love Create Celebrate invited me to her Scraps Made Modern series, I immediately thought about my scrap plywood pile and a technique I have wanted to try for a while: patterned plywood. Lindy is also working on some really fun scrapwood projects, so be sure to check those out. I will add a link to that in the description below as well as at the end of the video. Now let me introduce you to my scrap plywood pile. Here is my scrapwood pile. Now some of this is obviously there's walnut in there, which I'm not going to touch. I'm going to try to find something else to build out of that. But over here I have a whole bunch of different types of plywoods. I've got oak, I've got maple, I've got birch, I've got sanded plywood. There's also a whole bunch of little pieces. So I'm not quite sure what I'm going to be able to build out of it, but I'm going to go ahead and start ripping them and then we'll see what we can make. So I set my table saw at 1 1/8 inches, which is going to be the thickness of the patterned plywood. It's actually going to be just 1 inch, but that 1/8 of an inch is just an extra that I can sand off. And then I started ripping down all the pieces of plywood. I actually discovered patterned plywood when my friend Sam from DIY Huntress shared this gorgeous key holder. And then I discovered Fab, who is an absolute genius with patterned plywood. And I will add a link to both their channels in the description below. I ripped up lots and lots and lots of plywood strips. I think there were about 40 plus. I just lost count at some point. It is time for the glue up. I brought in all the strips of plywood that I wanted to use in the glue up and sort of arranged and sorted them so that they were well mixed with the different species of plywood. And then I poured lots of glue. I basically applied glue to all the surfaces that were going to be joining together and evenly spread it out. Now, as I clamped them together, I made sure that the ends were staggered so that there was a 45-degree angle at the ends, because I would be cutting them later at the 45-degree angle and this would minimize the wastage. Once they were nice and tight and secured, I let them dry overnight, but I also cleaned up all the glue squeeze out so that at least one surface was nice and flat. The next morning, the glue up was ready. I spent some time with my chisel removing the glue drips from the back because they can be a little hard on the planer blades. But most importantly, it was really therapeutic to do this. I then sent the board through the planer to even it out and get nice smooth surfaces on both sides. Now, if you don't have a planer, you can totally use a sander. It will just take a little bit of patience. My planer is limited to a 13-inch width, so I had actually split up the strips into 2 sets, so I had 2 panels of 13 inches each. Next up, chevron. I set my table saw crosscut sled at 45 degrees and cut off the ends. Now you could totally do this with a miter saw as well. Then I set the table saw fence at 2 inches and cut out a whole bunch of strips. Now, this time I had to make sure to keep all of the strips in order because that would make a difference on the pattern. A few pieces separated while I was cutting, probably because they didn't have enough glue, but that's okay. I can fix them later when I do the next glue up. So I've got two separate panels cut up, and my original plan was to put them together and make a larger panel. But I didn't think about it until I saw it that they look totally different because they're separate glue ups. But that's probably a good thing because now I get two panels to experiment and play with, and if I mess up one, I have a backup. And what am I making with them? I still don't know, but let's go ahead and do the next step, which is the chevron pattern, which is pretty straightforward. All you need to do is flip every other board and glue it up. I was really careful with board direction as I glued them up. I also needed a lot of glue because these are all end grains and they absorb a lot of glue. As I put them together, I had to be really careful about aligning all the patterns and to make sure that they don't slip on me as I put them together and clamp them. Since I had two sets of boards that I wanted to clamp, I just went ahead and added them to the same glue up without attaching it to the first set with glue. So basically, I just created two panels with the same glue up so I don't have to redo this all over again the next time around because I only have 4 clamps. Now, as I was putting this together, I sort of had a duh moment where I realized that I could not put these horizontally, but I could put these vertically together to create a long board of chevron pattern, and that would be great for maybe a bench or something of that sort. So that was going to be the plan. So the next morning, I had 2 chevron panels. I put them through my thickness planer to make sure that they were both nice and smooth and of the same thickness. I actually bought this thickness planer a couple of weeks ago in anticipation of this project, and I am so glad that I did. But yeah, I do need a better dust collection system with this for sure, and I need a stand to get this off of the floor because my back was definitely complaining at the end of this. But guess what? After all of that, the 2 patterns did not line up. They are so sensitive to variations that this was just not going to work. So it was time to go back to the drawing board and sleep over it. So since I have 2 panels, I have decided I'm going to go ahead and experiment some more with it. I will cut one of the chevrons into a circle, and one of these will keep them square. And let's take it from there. I brought it over to my miter saw to cut off the ends to get a nice straight edge. But as I cut it off, I saw the scraps and realized that I could actually make these concentric squares. So I set my table saw fence at 2 inches and went ahead and made the cuts. This time it was super important to keep all of them in sequence. To make the concentric squares, once again, you just have to flip every other strip, just like with the chevron. In this case, it is really important to keep them in sequence and order so you get the right pattern. And I was so focused on that I forgot to hit the record button on my camera. But it is basically a glue up exactly like all the previous glue ups with lots of glue and clamps, and making sure that the design does not shift as you clamp. So while the glue up was drying, I decided I was going to build some feet for that rectangular board to turn it into maybe a stool or a plant stand. So I found a bunch of 2x3s and 2x4s in my scrapwood pile and ran them through the planer and then ripped them into 2x2 boards. I then set my miter saw at 10 degrees and made some cuts for some angled legs. I made some pocket holes and then I put them all together to build these little angled feet. My glue up was ready and I was really excited with how it turned out. I sent it through the thickness planer a couple of times to clean it up, and then I took it over to my miter saw and cut off the ends to give them nice sharp edges. For the remaining chevron board, I decided to use the Lazy Susan hardware I had laying around that I had bought for another project a little while ago. For this, I needed to cut up circles. I used Build Basics tutorial to whip up a quick circle jig for my trim router. It is super straightforward, where you basically replicate the base of the router onto a board and attach that board with a nail to the center of your circle. And then you just pivot around the nail using a straight bit with multiple shallow passes until the circle is cut out. You do need a lot of shallow passes because the plywood is pretty hard and it can be really hard on the bit. I actually first tried this out on a piece of 1x10 board and cut out what is going to be the base of the Lazy Susan. During that, I found out that those shallow passes are key. Also, you gotta remember to go counterclockwise. And that is the circle. I filled in any gaps in the panels using wood putty and sanded down both of the panels using 220 grit sandpaper. I manually sanded the edges of the circle because I did not want to mess them up using my orbital sander. On the rectangular board, I used a roundover bit to soften the edges. Okay, so we're ready for the finish. We do see some variations over here, which is because I use different types of plywood in my original glue up, which is great for the chevron because I think it adds some nice character to it. But for the concentric squares, if that's what you're planning to do, you probably want to use the same type of plywood. In fact, plywood from the same sheet would be perfect. But that's okay. We're gonna go ahead and give this a finish. I finished the rectangular board with a water-based top coat. But for the Lazy Susan, I decided to use a food-safe cutting board oil. You can sort of see the difference between the oil-based and the water-based finish. The oil-based finish brings out the yellow and the brown tones of the wood, whereas the water-based finish keeps it looking pretty natural. I went ahead and painted the base of the Lazy Susan and the legs black. And then I attached the Lazy Susan hardware to finish it up. And finally, I attached the legs to the rectangular piece using countersink screws. And that is it. Those are the two pattern plywood projects made entirely out of scrap wood. I am so stoked with how these turned out, and I am now obsessed with this technique, and I have a million ideas in my head that I cannot wait to try. So stay tuned for that. Be sure to hop over to Lindy's channel to see what she turned her scrap wood into. And here are some more ideas on how you can turn your scrap wood pile into something useful and functional. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you next time.